All right, this round is being recorded. You guys are all aware of that?
Yep.
Cool. When the round finishes, if someone can please click the button to turn it off.
Is everyone ready to start? Do you care if programs are on or off time?
Off time's fine. Okay, that actually brings up a good point. If you're just gonna go like the contentions, then on case or whatever, we don't need new sheets of paper. Just say on and off. You don't have to do any more than that.
Okay. So now everyone's ready? Yeah. Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone in attendance, and I'm just going to go over the resolution, define the terms, explain our plan, and then go into 3 contentions. So starting my time now. So the resolution reads, the United States federal government should enact the Fair Minimum Wage Act of 2013. It's a pretty straightforward resolution. It says exactly what's going to happen. So the word should implies this is a policy round. So the United States federal government will be taking this action. The net benefits this round will be to the United States as a whole, as the United States federal government acts for the benefit of its own people. So the next thing is looking at what the Fair Minimum Wage Act of 2013 is, as it's going to be passed in this plan. There are 3 key components to the bill. The first is that the federal minimum wage is going to increase from $7.25 an hour to $10.10 an hour in 3 steps. So there are going to be 3-month segments where it increases 95 cents each until it increases 10.10, or until it gets to the 10.10 limit. The second thing is that there's going to be a separate rates for tipped workers. The current minimum wage for workers that receive tips, like waiters, is currently $2.13 an hour, and it's going to be raised to $7.07 an hour on the same incremental system. And then third, the plan adjusts for rising costs of living starting in 2016. So the minimum wage will increase with the cost of living, which is a key component here, as it's not happening right now. I'll take your point.
Okay, what was the increments again?
The increments, it increments in 3 steps, finishing in 2015 by 95 cents each. So it's not happening all at once. Instead, it'll go from 10.10 and it'll increase 95 cents again, and then again until it's at the full amount. So that's essentially the bill. There are those 3 key provisions. We see this has happened before. In 2007, there was a similar provision that raised it up to the current limit of $7.25, but we're seeing we need another increase as the cost of living has exceeded the minimum wage then, so it's no longer really adjusting for how much it costs somebody to live. So that's essentially what we're going to be talking about here in the round. The current minimum wage doesn't allow for someone to pay all of their costs. This is decreasing economic growth in the United States and hurting people's quality of life. So with that summary, now we all understand what the Act is. I'm going to go into my 3 contentions. The first is that the plan is going to increase consumer spending. Second is that it's going to increase quality of life. And third is that it's going to decrease the wealth gap. So looking through all these plans, first I'm going to say the harm, so what the problem is now, explain to you the link, what we're changing, and then the impact, so why it's better with our plan, benefits the American people and the United States as a whole. So first, looking at consumer spending. The harm here is that consumer spending is stalling the economic recovery. The government has had lots and lots of stimulus programs. We've seen them try to create jobs. We've seen them try to create infrastructure. But the key thing that isn't happening here is that people aren't making enough money. So even if someone is getting a job, it's not really enough of money to make to live now. So they haven't really been able to spend, because when you only have so much money, you're only allowed to, you can just spend on the bare essentials. And you can buy a house, you can buy food. Sometimes you can't even buy those things with the $15,000 a year that the minimum wage gives you. And so we're seeing harms here, because 70% of GDP is based on consumer spending. We're seeing a lack of growth in this area, and it's a key place. Just for a statistic here, the minimum wage has lost 30% of its value over the last 40 years, meaning it no longer, you made a lot more money 40 years ago if you made the minimum wage than you do now. So essentially, it isn't enough for people really to be spending. So the link here is that we're making more money for 30 million Americans, which is the number of Americans who are getting minimum wage jobs. So these 30 million Americans will all see a pay increase from either $7.25 to $10.10 or $2.13 to $7.07 with tips. So we're seeing, so the impact of this are, we can look to 2007 for a good example of what's going to happen. Is there was a similar provision that raised the minimum wage in the 3 incremental steps, approximately the same amount of money, approximately $3 in 2007. So in 2007, they saw a $104 billion boost in consumer spending. This is enormous. And we're going to see even more now, because now 6 out of 10 jobs created in economic recovery have been minimum wage jobs. So we're seeing that more people are making minimum wage than ever before, which is a key reason why we need to raise the minimum wage, because it's more important for more Americans. Yes?
Where's your statistic about like the 2007 $1.4 billion?
We got that from the Congressional Research Service, who did a report on looking at the effects of that. So essentially, a study by University of Chicago predicts that for every dollar increase in the minimum wage, you see $2,800 in an increase in consumer spending. We're going to see a huge impact of this. It's predicted that you're going to make 140,000 jobs out of this, as businesses will be seeing more consumer spending and in return be able to hire more people because of increased profits. We can see this as a huge boost to the economy. Furthermore, 67% of economists, due to the same University of Chicago poll, support this plan. So we can see their boost to consumer spending, which help businesses spend more money, And when businesses spend money, they can create more jobs, they can invest in research, and we're going to see beneficial things for the United States economy. My second contention is looking at quality of life for the American people. The harm right now is that people simply cannot live on $15,000 a year. It is not enough to get by in the modern world, and even though maybe it was in 2007, we've seen a lot of inflation over time and a vast increase in the cost of living that hasn't been accounted for in the minimum wage. A big harm of this is a lot of times people can't afford higher education, so once someone graduates from high school, the family cannot afford to send their kid to college. We see that college debt is over $1 billion right now. This is the specific harm that we're going to talk about in our plan. But obviously there are lots of other harms of people not being able to purchase things they need. A lot of people can't buy the food they need. They can't live in a district where they can feel that they can get a good education. We're seeing a lot of harms to quality of life because of this. A statistic from the Congressional Research Service says that the average affected person brings in 49% of their household incomes. These people who are making minimum wage are really important in their families and getting money. So the link here is that we increase people's quality of life by giving them more money every year. Essentially, the 30 million people who work minimum wage jobs will get more money. They're going to get a $3 increase in pay, which actually translates to a lot of money when you take into account that's per hour. People work a lot of hours a year, obviously. So we're going to see increases in quality of life because people can buy more things. Now, I'm not just saying that money brings happiness, but I'm saying that people can't afford key things that they need. People can't afford to live in a house that is in a clean neighborhood that's not violent or something. People can't afford to send their kids to college, which is crucial to get a job. In the future, so we see these long-term benefits of more people going to college because more families will be able to pay those costs. We're going to see huge increases in all these in quality of life and more people spending money in small businesses, which links back to the consumer spending example. But essentially, people are going to be happier because of this plan. When you can pay for your basic expenses and support your family, people are going to be happier, and then we also have the education benefit. Now, which brings me to my third contention, is that it's going to decrease the wealth gap. Now, there are a lot of people who work minimum wage, and there are a lot of people who are there are a few people who are extraordinarily rich in the United States and own the majority of the wealth. We see this as a harm in today's world because there's a lot of strife between these two groups, and it's simply unfair that a few people have so much of the wealth in the United States and so many people have so little. So we see that Obama campaigned on this in 2011. He talked a lot about how he wants to decrease the wealth gap, and then he did. We see that he wanted a pretty large victory. So we can see that this is an important issue, that Americans care about the wealth gap. We can also look for evidence this the 99%, 1%. Thing that we saw happening last year, that workers really care about this issue. People think it's important. Now the link here is that by increasing the minimum wage, you increase the amount of equity that's happening in people's pay. It's not that some people are making less than the poverty level, and other people are making lots. We agree that the wealth gap still exists. We're not saying we're solving it. We're saying we're lessening it. We're making it so that at least people can get by. And there are two impacts. First, we're going to see more political efficacy. People are going to be able to get along better, and people are going to respect the government more if they're making more money. See, the government cares about the wealth gap. They care that I'm not making enough money. We see a lot of benefits to civil obedience coming out of this. We saw a lot of riots last year. We saw a lot of people not supporting the government, saying the government doesn't care about me. We're going to see benefits to this. So for these three reasons, consumer spending, quality of life, and decreasing the wealth gap, I urge a vote for the affirmation team.
Really quick, just for judge clarification, everyone's okay with speed, right? You're all used to it? Okay. So first off, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. I'm going to go on to the neg case and then on the aff case. So the resolution reads, the U.S. federal government should enact the Fair Minimum Wage Act of 2013. My first point is going to be the loss of economic mobility, the loss of jobs. So uniqueness, subpoint A is we're currently trying to recover from an economic recession. B, the link is that this kills job. According to the Wall Street Journal, an 11% increase leads to 300,000 jobs lost just under those who are under the federal minimum wage. However, what they're proposing is a 39% increase in 1 year, and then they're also going to be exponentially increasing it over time, they're going to be increasing it over time, because what they're going to be doing is placing the whole adjusting for inflation, and so what this is going to do is to lead to even more loss of jobs. The C, the internal link, is that no job equals an extremely low quality of life and no way of working towards the future, and also I'm going to put in the piece of evidence into this internal link that according to Richard Burkhauser and Joseph Sabia from Yale University, 30% of minimum wage workers were in families with incomes exceeding 3 times the poverty level. So essentially what that means is that there's plenty of people who are on minimum wage who are reliant on, or who aren't completely reliant on these jobs, and they're able to have other sources of family income, but in enacting their plan, they're essentially going to be removing these jobs. Now, the 3 impacts I can derive from this subpoint D is the decrease of the quality of life, the decrease of the tax pool because there's less people working, and the increased spending to welfare and social programs to help the unemployed. So basically, the economic wash of the whole consumer spend, or the economic argument of the consumer spending is essentially a wash because we're going to have less people contributing to taxes and more people incurring the debt of society and increased spending. So, contention 2, is the loss of investment to companies. A uniqueness is that companies can't produce revenue to meet expectations and will experience massive loss of investments. B, the link is that this act decreases productivity of higher wage workers as they must assume clerical duties in smaller minimum wage paying jobs, and so they must assume this in order to save time and money. The company will have to fire many of these people, and then the debt will be incurred by the company, and so there will be a loss in investment. This leads to a few impacts. One is the slower growth for the U.S. economy. 2 is the drop in confidence in U.S. companies, and 3 is the idea of hegemony, which I'm going to get into right after your point.
Doesn't downsizing a company also significantly decrease investment?
Downsizing
a company as in firing workers.
Well, yes, it'll decrease investment. Yes, so if you have to raise minimum wage, then yes, if you have to fire a bunch of workers, it's not going to look very good, and then people aren't going to invest. I'm not sure if I'm understanding that question right. However, going on to my third impact from this is that we're going to be creating a bi-hegemonic world with China then surpassing us, because we will have to incur lower GDP growth, and then we'll get to the point of a nuclear standoff, Cold War-like situation. And I hate to link things to nuclear war, however, there will be a much better chance of everyone dying if this plan goes in place. And so just because we can talk about why people will be happier, that's just, fine and dandy. However, this is a huge loss of life for everyone, not just 30 million Americans, but 7 billion people. 3 is the idea of federalism. I'm also going to be linking this to the death of everyone. So A, uniqueness is the states that are able to determine their own minimum wage laws, and many in the South have to default to the federal minimum wage, but then many, like California, for instance, will raise it on their own. So the link to this is that the federal government is overstepping their power, doing what the states exactly don't want, because the state in California, per se, wants to have it at $8. If they want to have it at $9, they can enact that by themselves, but the federal government is overstepping their power, and this leads to a few major impacts. The first big one I'm going to be talking about is secession, the idea that southern states almost always have federal minimum wage, and much of their economy is reliant on, I don't think I got time to get to your point, much of their economy is reliant on low-paid jobs and low-paid wage, and so like the agricultural industry, for instance, and agricultural giant companies will no longer be able to hire them at this point, so that's a loss of productivity, and that's going to be economic detriments for the South specifically, and then their already inflamed movement of secession will be inflamed even more, and that will lead to a war, secession, and then we can link that right back into the hegemonic world of China versus the U.S. However, now it's not China versus the U.S., it's China versus the North and the South, and they'd be able to win in the nuclear war. So, going on to my fourth point, actually, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go on to their case now. So, onto their case, their first contention that the plan increases consumer spending. However, I already talked about why this is essentially a wash, because what's going to happen is with the loss of jobs, people are going to be demanding more spending from the government, and they're not going to be able to pay off, their basic living expenses, because they're no longer going to have jobs, especially the poor. And also I'd like to throw in the statistic that 17% of people who work in minimum wage are poor. Only 17% are below the poverty line. So they're not affecting everyone with minimum wage, but they are affecting 17%. And so, well, they're affecting everyone with minimum wage, but only 17% of that are actually in dire need of this bill. And so, essentially, this whole argument is a wash because, two economic sides cancel each other out. Their second point is the quality of life. This is basically just an impact they derive from their first, saying that people can, they can't live off $15,000. However, the Wall Street Journal shows that actually 34% of them can easily exceed living with the minimum wage job, and not everyone who works a minimum wage job is have like 3-4 kids or something like that. That's only like around 17%, as we said, from the Wall Street Journal. So essentially, plenty of people can have a perfectly high quality of life, 3 times the poverty line, with minimum wage in place as it is. We also talk about federalism, and I believe that should imply their impact behind this was that people will be happier. So let's just say that the plan completely works and people are happier, but it doesn't matter if they're all dead. So that can all be applied to my case. And 3 is the idea that this improves social mobility. However, that this all is derived from the economic argument, which remember is a wash because there's going to be more consumers, or there's going to be less consumer spending, because the consumer spending will simply cancel out the loss of revenue and of the tax pool. And so they talked about 2 impacts behind this, is that they're lessening the tops bracket. However, that's not true. You can't see anywhere where the top are going to be down. This is not wealth redistribution. Rather, it is simply saying that we're going to give those on the bottom a little more. However, we talked about why this is already overstepping the power, but this also leads to plenty of unemployment. So really what they're doing is they're actually pushing more people below the poverty line because companies can no longer pay for them. And unless the companies want to incur the massive amounts of investment loss and the loss of revenue, then they're going to have to fire workers and then drastically increase productivity, which, let's just link that back to their second contention, the quality of life. If people have to be extremely productive during the day, they're not going to be as happy. So even if you don't buy the whole idea that everyone's going to die, they're still not going to be happy because they're going to be have to be extremely productive because the company's going to have to cut plenty of ties. And so other countries that don't have such a high minimum wage are going to be able to compete much better. So because I adequately addressed all of their impacts, and even if you buy into every single impact they have in the case, you still have to look at the fact that this is increasing the chance of secession, increasing the chance of a hegemonic world and increasing the chance of nuclear war and death for everyone. So essentially, since lives takes precedence over happiness and lives takes precedence over social mobility and lives takes precedence over economics, we can look towards our case just in that, but I also believe I covered the whole idea of happiness and economics, and for all of those reasons, and because we don't want a nuclear war, I have the strongest vote in the negation. Thank you.
Okay. Alright, just gonna go off case and on case.
On case and off?
On case. Their case and on case. Okay. Alright, here we go. Thanks everyone for being here. Okay, I'd like to first point out that basically all of our opponents' impacts and contentions all rely on their assumption that this is bad for the economy, that this minimum wage will lead to job loss, and it will then we'll have a war with China and everyone will die. This is basically all their assumption. But I actually have some pretty good studies and historical empirical evidence of why this is not so. In 2010, the Review of Economic Statistics compared for the last 20 years employment levels in 250 pairs of neighboring U.S. counties and found that minimum wage increases had no effect on unemployment. Secondly, during the Reagan years, real minimum wage decreased and was accompanied by a slide in the ratio of unemployment. And this slide in the ratio, so the ratio of unemployment, of course, how many people are unemployed compared to how many workers there are, and this slide was only reversed when in 1990 the minimum wage was increased. So if we're looking at empirical evidence and statistics and review and studies done by prestigious economists and actually our own country's history, we can see that minimum wage raises have actually not corresponded at all to unemployment. And why is this so? This is so because as the Center for American Progress reports, prices would have to rise 0.21% each month instead of 0.20% each month as they had from 2010 to 2012 to pay for the extra minimum wage increase. So basically what this means is to basically pay for this new cost, companies are going to have to rise the price of goods, but as we can see, this rise in the price of goods will be cents on the dollar. So really we can see that the huge impacts of more people having more money outweighs the cents on the dollar cost to consumers. Yes?
For all your statistics, how much did the minimum wage actually increase?
Less than our proposed, more than our proposed plan, excuse me. So our plan is actually less extreme than as analyzed in all these statistics. So anyway, I'm going to continue. So basically, really, this whole assumption that job loss comes from minimum wage increases and that all this horrible stuff happens is really not in effect true. So really, our opponents can't access any of the benefits of their plan. Now, I have a lot to get through. I'm sorry. Okay, secondly, as we can see from the Center for American Progress again, profits for non-financial corporations rose 124% from 2008 to 2012. So much easier to combat these rising costs of paying their workers would just be to lower these huge bonuses for these executives of these corporations. And what are the benefits of this? Again, we're impacting into the decrease in the wealth gap, and we're impacting into political efficacy, but I'll get back into that later. So essentially, this first contention about loss of economic jobs is simply just not true. You can look to empirical evidence of the United States and our own history to know that this is not true. So next, I want to go to loss of investment. So our opponents are basically saying people will no longer want to invest in companies because these companies will be less profitable. But as I've stated, all that to remain the same profitability, all these corporations will have to do is rise the prices of goods by cents on the dollar, and they would still have the same profitability. So investors would still want to invest in their companies, and of course, companies want to have big profits, and they can still have these same profits just by either lowering the bonuses that they give to executives or barely rising the prices of their goods. Secondly, we're going to see more people are actually buying goods from companies. More people are spending their money because there's simply more people have money because of this real minimum wage increase. We can see that this affects a huge amount of people, a huge amount of Americans that will have more money in their pocket. And what are they going to do with this money? They're going to take this money and they're going to spend it on buying things. And so really this actually will help businesses because more people will be spending money. And so really this whole detriment to businesses doesn't actually happen. So now that we've kind of we've pretty much taken away all their economic kind of claims, we can come to these, the secession argument. And of course this is a little bit ridiculous because the United States has over and over again risen the minimum wage, and no states have yet to secede because of the rise in minimum wage. There's no reason why they would now do so. Our opponents don't really provide any new uniqueness about why all of a sudden all these all these states would decide to secede, and even and this is so ridiculous that a state would secede from the Union because of course there are huge economic and benefits to being in the United States. Increased trade, part of the most powerful country in the world, that I really don't even want to address this anymore. And basically, so if states aren't seceding, as our opponents suggest, and they haven't in the past, then their whole argument about China destroying us never really happens, yes.
Okay, when the economy of the South was threatened, didn't they try to secede in the past?
Yes, but we've seen that over and over. The United States has risen the minimum wage, and there's been no southern state has even thought about seceding. So this point is ridiculous. Okay, so now I'll go back into our own side of the globe. So basically now I want to go to this first contention of increase in consumer spending, and this is of course where we really have a whole bunch of kind of clash here. And our opponents basically say that this is a wash because of the job loss, but I've proven that the job loss doesn't exist, therefore this is not a wash because we are seeing more money in the hands of people. And since our economy is 70% spending, our GDP is 70% spending, if we increase spending, we increase the GDP, and more people have money to spend, they have higher quality of life, but we also have more money to put into education, we have a higher tax base, more taxes mean better health services, means we're saving lives, means we're improving our infrastructure, which means more economy, better economy in the future. And of course, we have more money to spend on education. And if we want to avoid a war with China, we could be spending money on our education. That will help our test scores and improve our the competitiveness of our students. Our opponents kind of say only 17% of people only have minimum wage job, but then 35. These kind of claims contradicting themselves. And even if you buy that only 17% of people will be helped by this, that's still 17% of people that are being helped. Next thing I want to talk about is quality of life. Of course this will help the quality of life of people. If people have more money to spend, we can see that all our opponents talk about is that they're losing jobs, but they're not losing jobs. So they have more money to spend, they have more money to spend on education, and we just have a happy populace. And maybe this doesn't sound like a big deal to the opposition, but it means that when we have a happier populace, we have more people who are just excited about being alive, and we have more people who like the government and think the government is doing good things for them. We have more participation in the democratic processes, and we just have more efficiency on the whole. And the last thing I want to talk about is the decrease in the wealth gap. And of course, this is a big issue. A lot of people cite this as one of the key issues that is facing the United States public, and this is kind of pushed back against by the government, and therefore we are increasing fairness in America. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out here and making today's debate possible. I'll first be moving on to the affirmation case and the negation case. So the first contention today talked about how the plan increases consumer spending. This somehow leads to better unemployment. How the responses they had to the 1 and C arguments were as follows. Number 1, job loss doesn't exist. Number 2, there's more means. And number 3, we have increased government spending. However, I'd like to just speak their own statistic that they actually brought up. They only talked about in 2010 for the past 20 years minimum wage increase. But there are a lot of different economic factors that can actually contribute to this, but the evidence we actually bring up from the Wall Street Journal directly links the 11% increase in wage increases to 300,000 jobs lost. So even though we have conflicting evidence, we want to prefer our evidence because it looks at a smaller time period, number 1, and number 2, there's more factors that can actually influence their evidence that they bring up in today's round. Also, they talked about Ronald Reagan and how basically his economic policy was that he increased the wages of workers at the same time. However, we have a drastically different plan in place because they're trying to implement a 39% increase in wages, which is drastically different than what happened with Ronald Reagan. You can't compare these two examples, they're completely different. So all this whole idea about loss of jobs, we need to prefer our evidence because it looks at a shorter time period, it provides direct causation, while theirs in instance it only looks at the past 20 years. Number 2, they always talk about increased government spending. So even though they want to have all these impacts of government spending, increased education spending and stuff, that can't occur if Americans aren't working and they don't have jobs and can't provide income taxes for the government. So if that can't happen, that reputation completely falls. I'll take your point.
Do you have any example of a time when minimum wages increased and unemployment has increased?
Our study actually looked at that. It said, as I'll say again, kills jobs 11%, leads to 300,000. So number 3, they only talked about only 17%, or excuse me, they're So they just talked about the increase in government spending. We've already hit this. All right, so let's move on to the second affirmation contention today, which talks about the quality of life of Americans. This is our only impact in today's round. And number one, it's not terminalized. Number two, all the second affirmative speaker also talked about is that more people like the government. However, they won't like the government more if they are out of job. If people are out of work and they're unemployed, then how can we actually expect these individuals to go and actually like the government? It doesn't make any sense. Number three, they talked about the decreased wealth, and they keep harping on this idea that we increase fairness. However, we provide a link turn in this scenario because of the statistics my partner brought up. So according to the Yale University professors we cited, 34% of the minimum wage workers were in families with incomes exceeding 3 times the poverty level, while 17% of those who work in minimum wage are actually poor. So we can see from this example is that the people who are working for minimum wage, there's only 17% of those individuals are actually poor. So all that means is that you're putting more money in on top of that, the majority there's more people who are in the top income bracket from families of those top income brackets. I'm not necessarily saying CEOs are going to work in minimum wage. What I'm saying is that there's people from those specific families who are going to go work those. Yeah, I'll take your point.
Are you saying that more money would not be good for this 17% of families?
I'm not saying more money would necessarily be bad, but what I am arguing today is that the unemployment increase offsets that, so it just makes the argument a wash. So what we can see from this, example is that literally more money goes to the higher income families, so to say. So all that does is increases income disparity, which outweighs a lot of their points about increased investor confidence and stuff. Because a lot of income disparity in the United States and income inequality affects our own economic decisions and the own health of our own economy. Let's move on to the off-case argument. So our first one today talked about loss of jobs, and we specifically had our statistics. Already, you can cross-apply all the refutations I brought to their own statistics to the 2010 example and the Ronald Reagan example. But moreover, the second affirmative speaker today cites how in their own statistics that the price of American goods actually increase, and this is necessarily negative because that means the price of United States exports increase, which in turn hurts the United States economy because if our exports cost more, then that means people in other countries aren't necessarily going to buy these goods, further leads to economic impacts. Number three, they talked to profits, how profits for companies actually rose from 2008 to 2012, but what they failed to realize is there's been a lot of federal and state policy that could have actually caused this. How do we know that's necessarily linked to the minimum wage? And even then, minimum wage increased in 2007, but from 2008 to 2012, we had literally an economic meltdown, we had TARP, we had all these different government stimuli programs. How can we necessarily relate that to the minimum wage? Second, we talked about loss of investment. So they talked about how more people are actually going to spend on the economy, but they can't actually spend on the economy if they don't have any money in their pockets, which leads to the unemployment arguments we actually bring up. They also talked about how these detrimental impacts won't occur. So for all the thermonuclear war impacts we bring in today's round, even if you don't believe a lot of those arguments today, you still have to look at the idea that if the United States economy is hurt, if we lose hundreds of thousands of jobs, that decreases our economic stability, which then hurts the United States hegemony, which creates a bipolar world. So if you don't believe the secession argument that we bring up in today's round, you still have to look at the hegemony argument, which there's not a lot of ink on the flow from the affirmation about that argument. So if the loss of the United States hegemony is obviously bad, because if we have a bipolar hegemonic world like in the Cold War, we only increase the risk of conflict and loss of human life. So the main things you need to be evaluating in today's round is number one, the statistics we bring up versus they bring up. They bring up all these vague statistics that show correlation but not actually causation. They bring up these statistics from Ronald Reagan's type of era, but we live in a new type of United States economic policy. I'm not going to take your point at this time. So we have to look to our statistics. We clearly show that when wages increase, it leads to 300,000 jobs lost. If jobs are lost, that directly hurts the United States economy. It prevents quality of life from actually occurring, and all it does is exacerbates the income inequality that we actually bring up. So you also have to look at the offense we put on their case by link turning the third contention today. So the main reason why you should vote unemployment, you literally increase income inequality by giving more money to the wealthier families versus the poor families, which is only 17%, and you also create a bipolar hegemonic world, which is not necessarily beneficial if we want to prevent war. So for all these impacts, it should be a clear vote for the negation.
Take time for question.
Yeah, I'll take it. Yeah.
Sure. Isn't it true that your evidence is mostly projections, whereas ours actually looks at empirical evidence?
Ours isn't necessarily projections. It actually looked partly at empirical evidence, but it was looking more at a shorter time period where you can actually show improved causation better.
Okay, everyone ready? So this is my last speech as the affirmation today. I usually don't do all the policy impacting stuff, but I thought it'd be fun. So I'm going to be going into a lot of that. And first I'd like to get onto my voter issues. One is inherency. The idea that essentially they say there's going to be no backlash whatsoever, but then that doesn't show why we haven't done it in the past. And so what we claimed is that there's a Wall Street Journal article both looking at how other countries have been affected by minimum wage and also relating it to this time period, saying just an 11% increase will lead to 300,000 loss, and then they're offering a 39% increase, and then double that, or not double, but increase that over time because it's adjusting for inflation, so they're incurring much more loss of jobs. They can say in the past that we increased minimum wage, I didn't get an exact amount, but maybe it's $1 or something, and that hasn't incurred much damage. However, since the Wall Street Journal has looked at how this will affect now, we need to see that our evidence, or at least the judges need to see that our evidence is directly linked to what will happen now, rather than looking at how it's happened in the past. And so, because of that, we do, I believe, win on the economic argument, but even if we don't, we're going to be talking about loss of lives and impact and all that, great stuff. And so, my second voter issue is the idea of what's linked to what, and this is essentially everything on their case is linked to the economics. Everything is, the consumer spending, quality of life, and social mobility. That's all due to the economics. However, even if this economics argument is a wash, even if you believe that, I believe we won, but even if you believe that, we can still look to the one argument that's actually a cultural problem, and that is secession of the South. They said that it never has happened, and it will not happen. However, I do believe it'll happen because the South is already proposing secessions. Every single state has had petitions sent to the White House, and if we do, and as I said, this will target directly the South, because what it'll do is the South that is heavily reliant on agricultural and low-paid individuals, they will no longer be able to employ these, or simply they'll suffer the backlash of having to increase their wages. Remember, the South already defaults to the federal minimum wage. They don't want to increase the minimum wage, so the federal government overstepping its power might be the tipping point for the South in order to secede, and then that will directly link it into the hegemonic world. Even if you think that our GDP is going to remain growing, you still have that hegemonic world. And so if you're going to be looking at the economics, or if you're going to be looking at the impacts, you need to weigh lives, or at least the probability or the potential that lives will be lost over the happiness of the people, because lives do take precedence over people. People can't be happy if they're all dead. And so because of that, I'd just like to go into my third voter issue, which I basically just stated, but it's the impact calculus. Even in both sides of the world, if the economics argument is just a wash, the cultural argument still flows right through, and we gain more deaths. Well, essentially they gain more deaths by enacting the plan, even with the happier people. So then going on to the idea of the loss of jobs, this is basically under the same voter issue, is they talked about why in the past a certain number of jobs weren't lost, or essentially there wasn't much economic backlash, but we have to consider the empirical evidence, or excuse me, the evidence that the negation team has brought up in this speech, because what we did was we directly looked at a minimum wage increase and we gave an exact percentage and what would happen from the Wall Street Journal, a very credible source, and then they also cited that if it increased more, it goes up exponentially. And then let's look at the harms. This is my fifth voter issue, and the harms they brought up are actually much more mitigated than they'd like us to believe, and that is that, according to Richard Burkhauser and Joseph Sabia, as we stated, 30% of the minimum wage workers are in families of incomes that exceed 3 times the poverty level. So a huge portion of people on minimum wage don't need this. They're already living a perfectly comfortable life, so they don't gain access to the idea of increased happiness and social mobility and whatnot, because they're already enjoying a good life. Only 17% will be affected in their way if you buy their economic argument, but then due to the loss of investment, that's simply canceled out. So because of the idea, and the main thing you're going to be voting on today is even if there's just a potential, as they talked about, they said that the argument was just ridiculous. However, they never really attacked the link or the uniqueness or anything of it. They only said that it was pretty ridiculous. But if we even have the potential of the South seceding and then creating the bi-hegemonic world and then nuclear war or any sort of war that would ensue, there's still lives on our count. There's absolutely no lives on theirs. Therefore, even though there's economics on theirs, and we believe there's economics on ours as well, the lives is what's going to take precedence, and that's what the net benefits to the United States will be enforced as, is lives taking precedence over economic. I can't stress that enough. And for all these reasons, I hope for the strongest vote in the negation. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? I'm just going to go over the voters. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of secession. The China argument wasn't really extended through the flow past the first speech, so I don't think we need to go over it anymore. We discussed how we already have this strong economic relationship, it's really likely, and they didn't mention it again, so I'm assuming we're done with that. So first, going on to the federalism and secession argument. Now, this is a non-unique issue. They haven't discussed why now the South would leave the Union if they haven't before. In my first speech, I discussed that we raised the minimum wage in 2007. Yes, the South, they have secession petitions all the time. They're just kind of angry. In general, they haven't proven that any of these petitions are actually real, anything's actually going to happen. My partner talked about the economic benefits of being in the United States. This was never responded to. So you can extend the argument that the South benefits economically from being in the United States. So you can assume that any negative economic impact from raising the minimum wage wouldn't counteract this. Being in the United States, the economic benefits of that are more important than any detriments you may see from increasing the minimum wage in the South. So this really just isn't an issue in this round. So I'm going to move on to something more important. I'm going to compare the impacts looking at the two main groups affected here. First, businesses. How will businesses respond to the increase in minimum wage? And then second, looking at the benefits to workers, those who would still be employed if you believe that there would be some unemployment. So first, I'm going to go over the issue of what will businesses do. Essentially, the negation team says that they will fire workers. This is the default thing that businesses go to. However, my partner brought up two alternatives that weren't really discussed. He talked about how firing workers is kind of the last-ditch thing businesses want to do. They do not want to downsize. Downsizing looks really, really bad. They don't like to do it. So there are other things that businesses try to do instead. So we talked about two other options. My partner discussed the statistic that first, prices go up 0.2%. 0.20% every month, and with this plan they're going to go up 0.21% every month if you just increase prices. This is a negligible price increase of products. This is far more likely that businesses will do this, raise products 0.01% per month, rather than fire workers, because it looks better for the business and it maintains revenue, whereas when you fire workers you lose productivity. This is better for businesses to do this instead of fire workers. The next thing that's better for businesses to do is just give CEOs smaller bonuses. There really aren't any detriments for businesses here. We said these two things are more likely, and this was never counteracted, so you can extend those arguments throughout the flow. It is more likely that businesses will use other measures rather than resorting to unemployment. But if you do think employment is likely, you need to look at the statistics brought up in the round. We've talked about how ours are evidence-based, theirs are predictions, they said theirs are evidence-based. But ours were all evidence-based in the United States. The Wall Street Journal looked at a couple of different countries, while ours looked primarily in the United States. But you've heard all these statistics, and essentially the statistics seem to be kind of a wash here. There are a lot of statistics from both sides. We discussed how the Wall Street Journal is biased, and Chicago's better, and this and that, so I'm just going to move on from this. But even if you believe that there will be unemployment from this plan, it's better to have people who are working and the people who are working to be getting higher wages. It's more important to have those who are working getting higher wages than necessarily having everyone working getting lower wages. So even if you do believe that unemployment will come out of this plan, which we don't think it will because businesses will turn to alternatives, you still see economic benefits for the affirmation. And that's because consumer spending is more important than necessarily the unemployment rate. Consumer spending is the foundation of business growth and investor confidence. We talked about how consumer spending is 70% of GDP, and consumer spending is what bases investor confidence. Something that the negation team talked about heavily in their second contention. So you can kind of give us all of those impacts. They never really negated the idea that consumer spending would increase for those who are still employed. So even if you do believe that some people will be unemployed because of this plan, you should still vote for the affirmation on economic impacts, because the businesses will still benefit from consumer spending by those who are making even more money than they ever were before. And consumer spending is going to lead to all of the beneficial things for the economy, even if there is some small dip in employment for some reason. So consumer spending really outweighs everything else in this round. It's the fundamental basis of the economy. When people are spending money into businesses, because they have $3 more every single hour, you're going to see huge amounts of money increasing for these families. They say, oh, well, only 17% of families who make the minimum wage are actually below the poverty line. Exactly. So you're going to see 1/5 of Americans who are below the poverty line now spending more money. You're still going to see wage increases for those who are above the poverty line, and that money typically goes into banks, and bank money is good as well. So we're seeing more spending. We're seeing a lot of economic benefits under this plan. You should prefer our economic benefits to their economic benefits because ours are more important. Are the fundamental basis of business growth, whereas unemployment is less fundamental to business growth. Unemployment really doesn't relate as much. They haven't linked it exactly into business growth, which is the main thing we've been talking about in the round. However, it's clear how consumer confidence relates to business. Consumer confidence and consumer spending relates, because when consumers spend money, the money goes into the business can use that money to expand their business, they can use it to create new products, to do all of these things, and ultimately to create jobs. So our impact, even if we do see unemployment because of this plan, we're going to see a net increase in employment because of the consumer spending, which has never been negated. So you can really turn all of these impacts in our favor because they haven't really argued against any of these things. They agree that 70% of the economy is consumer spending. So you see that consumer spending is inevitable because of this plan. They haven't even said that all people are going to be fired. It's maybe a small amount of people. We don't think this is true. Even if you think this is true, all people who still have jobs will be spending more money. You're going to see net benefits to the economy. You're going to see, you can turn the whole impact on China if you're still interested in that one. But we're going to see benefits. When more people are spending money, more people are, the businesses can grow. They can hire more workers. We're going to see benefits for U.S. image and soft power from this. So when more people have money, we're going to see all the benefits of the increase in quality of life, which is never really contended by the negation. So even if you do believe that there is unemployment for some, there's an increase in quality of life for others. So in this round, you should be voting on first, benefits to businesses, and second, benefits to workers. Thank you.
Alright.